Twitter's the one we focus on, but it's not just Twitter. I mean, he's chosen every form of medium to communicate, and that is I mean, you know, all the talk shows he would, during the campaign, that he would call into over and over and over again, and things like that. So I think, you know, he will probably be a much more accessible president. But it's interesting because for all of that transparency and accessibility and so forth, you know, the folks in Washington are focused like a laser beam on the mysterious Trump Tower, who's being chosen for what jobs in there, which is completely opaque. So, you know, the Secretary of State search, you know, I mean, people were betting, everybody would have lost tons of money because, you know, one day it was, you know, Mitt Romney, and the next day it was General Petraeus, and the next day it was going to be Jim Stavridis, and the next day, and all these other things. And so, you know, there is a basic level of opacity to any of these kinds of decisions, whether they're personnel or diplomatic or policy making. And I don't have a reason to think that just because he has tweeted so much and things like that, that the administration itself wouldn't be able to, you know, keep secrets in the Situation Room or between, you know, two world leaders. I mean, it hasn't been the Trump side that's even read out the phone calls he's had with world leaders. It's all been on the other side. So.
Would you maybe introduce yourself?
I am Rick Thoman. I'm a executive committee board member here. Just a question about Trump as a leader. How is he at picking people and listening to them? And as you watched him during the campaign, how did he grow in the campaign? In terms of what happened in the campaign to his leadership style? And do you come out of all this observations more or less concerned than you might have been a few months ago?
Well, I can't answer that last question. About concern, because it's not a journalistic emotion. But let me start with your question about how he recruits people. I mean, it's pretty distinctive. Do I like this person? That being said, he is a surprising boss in many ways. And I'll just give you an example of when we did a large story about his relationship with women. We found that Donald Trump had done a pretty remarkable job of empowering female executives at his company and trusted them, gave them a lot of authority. But those same women and men who worked with him would tell you that he could be very whimsical and mercurial, and he could have flashes of temper that were like nothing they had ever seen in a workplace. And it could be kind of trauma-inducing. But that he also knew how to express gratitude. He understood the value of a handwritten note at a goodbye party, or, you know, Tiffany watch when you had reached a certain number of years of service at the Trump company. But it was all very personal. It was kind of a family affair. It was a family company. And I think you have to remember, when you think of him as a leader, that he came up as the son of Fred Trump in a family real estate business. And that company has remained pretty insular. I mean, it certainly has relationships around the world, but it does business in the mold and spirit of Donald Trump. It's not a modern workplace with HR systems and processes. I mean, it's nothing like the law firm we're sitting in, or a publicly traded company like the New York Times. It's just so funny. I just got an email from the Times that was our quarterly ethics hotline reminder about ethics at the New York Times. I don't suspect that email goes out of the Trump company, although I'm perfectly open to being corrected on that. And how has he changed as a candidate? I don't know that he changed all that much from the beginning of the campaign. I mean, he began his campaign in June of 2015 by declaring, among other things, that Mexicans, rapists and criminals, they were crossing our border and that they were a threat to our country. And by the end of the campaign, he was suggesting Hillary Clinton should maybe be gone, thrown in jail, occasionally inviting Russia to maybe hack her email. So those provocations never changed, and I don't know that he became that much more strategic a candidate, but he certainly figured out who he needed around him who could provide a little more discipline, even if that discipline was sometimes a little more superficial and real. And by the end, he did find Kellyanne Conway and Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and that proved to be a winning team. And we still don't quite understand how they interact with him and when they can tell him no. And that's going to be one of the great kind of mysteries of this White House. Who can tell Donald Trump that you don't do that? Or do you have to find kind of clever ways to do that? Is is he open to listening to that message? I don't think we really know that.
Richard, maybe you would like to, on similar question to the hiring process, is how those nominees are going to go through Congress, and do you expect battles there? I mean, there's a lot of controversy, obviously, about Tillerson's appointment. Do you think it will go smoothly, or it might not go at all?
Well, there certainly will be drama in the hearing rooms for Tillerson and for most of the nominees. But if, you know, it used to take 60 votes in the Senate to confirm someone to the executive branch, and the Democrats a couple of years ago changed the rules so they get Barack Obama's nominees through, particularly to the judiciary. So now, other than Supreme Court nominees, but for all executive branch nominees, it only takes 50 votes, or 51 votes. But with Mike Pence as the tiebreaker, it takes 50 votes because he's the president of the Senate. Right now, the Republicans will be going in with 52 votes because they just won Louisiana. So you could lose 2 Republicans and lose every single Democrat and still get every nominee through. And for every Republican that you lose, in addition to the 2, all you do is pick up 1 Democrat for each of those. And so it's hard for me to see which nominees are going to see 2+ Republican defections and lose every Democrat. I mean, you'd have to have something pretty compelling to people. So what I think you're going to end up seeing on some of these is, you know, party line votes, because it'll be a free vote for the Democrats because it won't matter, and the Republicans will be disciplined. You might get a Rand Paul or somebody like that who's already said, talk about a few people that he might oppose. But it's going to be pretty hard to stop nominees from going through.
Can I say one thing? I don't think there is such a thing when Trump was president as a consequence-free vote against him. I'm not so sure that there is. I mean, it's possible, but this is a person who remembers slights from his childhood and will nurture a grievance for decades. And so I think, you know, the idea that anyone can vote against him just to have party deference, that it won't cost them when they need something from the White House, and I don't need to challenge you. I think that people need to recognize how delicate his ego can be at times, and that I'm not sure that, you know, that anything will be consequence-free when it comes to opposing him.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. When I said free vote, I meant that the vote wouldn't have consequence in the stopping of the nomination.
That's right, fair enough.
Trump has been talking about how much the Times has treated him unfairly. And I wonder whether or not now you feel that perhaps because Trump is so at odds with some of the principles that the Times and reporters and journalists for the Times are in favor of, they are somewhat obsessive now with Trump. Not that they're treating him inaccurately, but treating him obsessively, too much, so much that every tweet he makes, the Times either has an article saying how ridiculous it is, or how superficial it is, and how unlike a president-elect, something the president-elect should not be doing. As a reader of the Times, one gets, you know, I think all of us are fed up with the coverage that Trump has with the media generally. And I think the Times is perhaps as guilty as any in the media with respect to that.
Let me just clarify what you're talking about. The volume of it, is that what you mean, or the content of it?
No, not the content of it, because I think the content of it it's very easy to disagree with whatever Trump is saying. I think it's the fact that perhaps too much focus and weight is given to very irrelevant things which Trump is doing. He's basically, is reality TV, and reality TV does not really command the amount of attention which the Times is given.
I mean, so I just want to be really clear. I'm not the executive editor of the Times, and I'm not a public editor, and so I'm not sort of any kind of spokesman for the paper. So let me give you a little bit of history, and then just tell you what it's like myself grappling with the questions that I think you've raised. I mean, one is that Donald Trump is a New Yorker. He grew up here. He's always had a really interesting relationship with all the news organizations in New York, whether it's the New York Post or the New York Daily News, and yes, the New York Times. I think he cares very much about the New York Times. I think he cares about the coverage in the Times. At times, he's had incredibly warm relationships with the paper and its editors, and you can go to the New York Public Library and call up the archives of letters he's exchanged with former executive editors of the paper that show his reverence for the paper, calling it the great institution of the New York Times. When Donald Trump came to the editorial board meeting a few weeks ago that I attended just across town, he once again called the New York Times kind of I don't want to screw up the quote, it was essentially something like a treasure, something to be a jewel kind of in our country and in our news media. So I think it's fair to say that the relationship has vicissitudes and that sometimes it's dependent on the nature of the coverage. When I went in to go talk to Donald Trump about his relationship with Twitter 2 years ago, he wanted to talk about it for 45 minutes and take out his phone and show me how it worked, and he liked that story that I wrote about how he has mastered Twitter. I then got on the phone with him to talk about his relationship with women, and he raised his voice and was essentially, very displeased with that story. So I think, and he called on me to resign from the Times, which was an unusual experience, and he did it on Twitter. So we grapple with an unusual figure in Donald Trump, and we ask ourselves all the time, what's the balance between covering what he says and how he says it, or not covering it? And that's a debate that's going to keep happening now that he's president. And he is now president, so what he says is newsworthy almost by definition. And when he says something on Twitter, the presumption is that it may be newsworthy and we need to think about it. But you're asking a question that we're asking too, so I don't want you to think you're alone. We're grappling with this uniquely challenging question of how to cover any president, but especially this president. And I know that might be an unsatisfying answer, but I don't want you to think that we go back to the office and kind of mindlessly or robotically just report something that anybody says, whether it's the president or some business executive. But instead we think about it a lot.
No, I'm just blaming you for where we are.
Maybe we could take those two questions there and then we go. Could we
I
take
think
two
Trump
questions?
ever thought he would become president, and did he have a chance to get prepared for the job?
Did he ever think he would be president? I think that may be unknowable, but we know he's been talking about the idea of running for president since the 1980s. I went back and reread and wrote a story about an interview he did with that august publication called Playboy in 1980. And Donald Trump was already thinking about the exact same issues internationally that he's talking about now, which is how countries are screwing the United States, trade deals are bad, we're not getting what we need out of the foreign relationships we have, the troops and the protection we provide to countries in Asia and the Middle East. He saw himself as somebody who had a vision and an aspiration to lead the country, and he even understood who would vote for him. I went back and I found that quote this morning because I wondered if it might come up, and he was asked by the Playboy interviewer, who would vote for you if you ran for president? He said the working man would vote for me. I can see it when taxi drivers pass me on the street and they roll down their window and when they yell to me. He understood even then, when he was a brash guy driven around in a limousine with a license plate DJT, that he still had some interesting and somewhat inexplicable appeal to kind of working America and its aspirations. They somehow embodied their dreams for themselves, and he rode that to the White House 30 years later.
Thanks. I'm curious to flip how Donald Trump relates to possibly other countries to how countries will relate to Donald Trump, given some of these personality peaks that you've been discussing. And sort of a specific example being Russia and Putin, and then more broadly for Richard. So everybody assumes that he's going to have a great relationship with Putin and Russia, until the one moment that Putin does something where he feels like he didn't get enough deference or respect, and then we all know that he may be very unpredictable. So will that actually ironically translate into a better deterrent effect for the United States? Will people or other countries strategically be maybe, acceding more to US interests because they don't want to test the reaction that might come if he's upset by something that they do? Will we be less tested by North Korea, by Iran, by Russia and China because they don't want to bring about an unpredictable response?
Yeah. So what you're talking about is the madman theory of international relations. And it actually is called the madman theory. This was coined during the Nixon administration when Nixon wanted it to appear to the Soviets. He moved up the DEFCON levels and put the nuclear forces on alert because he wanted them to think that he was crazy enough, maybe, to go to nuclear war, and therefore they would be deterred from taking actions they otherwise were interested in taking. The problem with the madman theory is if you have a madman, but you have to walk this line by portraying yourself as a credible madman on the one hand, but on the other hand, not really a madman. So it's hard to pull off. Trump has actually offered a sort of a different variant on this, which is the unpredictability theory of international relations, right? That we've been telegraphing our intentions to ISIS and other countries for way too long, and that he's going to stay on the balls of his feet and be unpredictable, and therefore will have he probably would put it this way, but leave others in an information deficit, and therefore have a strategic advantage in whatever comes next, negotiations or confrontation or whatever it is. And that's not crazy. There are some instances in which actually I think that could be beneficial. So for example, with China, over the past few years, China has been the unpredictable one. China has been the one taking the unexpected steps in the relationship, while the United States has been trying to be predictable and stable so we can keep a lid on any potential for hostilities and so forth. But I think there is a case to be made for the United States to be a bit more unpredictable and inject some unexpected things into the relationship. The point, though, is that has to be done pursuant to a plan and a policy. It can't be unpredictable for the sake of being unpredictable. It has to be unpredictable for the sake of achieving something. And you have to think a couple of chess moves ahead. If we do this if we take a phone call with Taiwan, or if we question the one China policy, then China's going to react probably this way, and then our reaction to their reaction should be this. That's kind of the way you need to think through these things. And once he is in office, he will have armies of advisors and departments that are there willing to help him think through that if you would like to. It can be crafted, and then there's other cases where it's precisely the opposite. I think is the case. With ISIS, you want to tell them, you got to give up, there's no way out, rather than sort of, well, let's see what happens. So it just depends on how.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add, other than that unpredictability is at the heart of his negotiating strategy in business when it comes to creditors, when it comes to neighborhood activists. There's a famous story when Donald Trump was negotiating that West Side project. That is, if you go the West Side Highway, you can see all the buildings labeled Trump as you make your way up towards the Bronx. Some of them were starting to remove the name Trump, which I'm sure is very painful for him. That was a signature project for him. And when he was negotiating with neighborhood activists, it was this epic battle. The neighborhood desperately wanted to stop these huge buildings. They didn't want the views blocked. They thought it was all out of scale. And it was a titanic battle of activists and lawyers and Trump. And he made some very extraordinary demands, and they all thought they were at the end. They all thought this was headed for a tremendous collision, and he shocked all of them by coming to the table and pretty much agreeing to a lot of the compromises they were asking for after an incredibly drawn-out, ugly process. And Richard, when you talked about unpredictability as a guiding force in his foreign policy, I look back at the interview he did with my colleagues David Sanford and Maggie Haberman. He did 2 interviews, and these were extraordinarily amusing interviews in which he made the declaration that he might not abide by Article 5 of NATO, and that everything was basically negotiable. And one of the things he told them was, when it came to the deal in Iran, he wished that America had walked away a few times. That was his quote, that we'd been less predictable. And I think he looks at the way President Obama has handled the red line in Syria, or any number of other things, and he sees a weakness in what he views as the predictability of how Barack Obama will react, and that reaction not being strong enough, maybe volatile enough. And I think that's going to be fascinating to watch when we become president.
Thank you. Given the number of military portfolios that the President-elect has designated, what impact do you think it will have, might have on foreign policy? Thank you.
Yeah, this has been a big question for those. Did everybody hear the question?
No.
Okay. No?
Maybe
Yeah, so the question was, given the number of military, former military officers that are playing a role in his administration, what role will that play in foreign policy? Part of this is driven by the number of people he's interviewed rather than the number of people he's appointed. I mean, he's got 3 generals now. He's got General John Kelly as the Department of Homeland Security, General Jim Mattis as Secretary of Defense, and General Mike Flynn as National Security Advisor. Obama had 3 when he came in. It was General Jim Jones was National Security Advisor. He had General Eric Shinseki of the Veterans Administration. I can't actually remember who the 3rd was, but he had a 3rd doing something. But part of this has been sort of, what's that?
Blair.
Admiral Blair, that's right. Admiral Blair as the Director of National Intelligence. So he had 3. So far, Trump has 3. I think part of this is driven by the fact that the search for Secretary of State was so unbelievably public. I mean, we don't know how many former generals Barack Obama or George W. Bush interviewed for jobs because this was like super hush-hush secret instead of, come out in front of the cameras and then up through, Trump Tower, and then, you get 24 hours while everybody dissects your life, and then we move on to the next person. And so I think that's created a sense that there's going to be a whole lot more retired 4-stars than, in fact, there are. Now, again, he could appoint some more, but they're starting to run out of slots here. I think that in general, the one that matters most is Secretary of Defense. You need to have statutorily, you have to wait 7 years after you retire from the military in order to take that, unless you get a waiver from Congress. And that's good in principle. You want to have clear civilian control over the military, where the military is executing the civilian policy and the civilian commands. The last time we did this was about 7 years ago, and so I think if we, given that I think Jim Mattis is so far and above some of the other folks who were mentioned for Secretary of Defense, I think if we, break that every 70 years, we're okay. If we start doing that every, 7 months, then we'll probably need to think hard about that.
Can I want to twist your question around a little bit, rather than what will be the impact of having a general, because I don't think we know yet, to a bit of biography about why Donald Trump has such an affinity for people in the military. And we just go back to when Donald Trump was 13 years old. That's when his parents, living in Queens, sent him away to military school because he'd been a terrible kid, getting into all sorts of fights and bringing a knife to school. And so his parents sent him to the New York Military Academy up by West Point, and it was the signal event of his, adolescent life. Going to that military school, being a boarding student there, having the experience of it being a severe all-boys culture with military kind of leadership at the top, the discipline of taking Brasso and using it against the belt buckle every day. He's still obsessed with it. He thinks it's the best possible way to clean brass. And the culture in which the way you showed your mettle was by being the best, and knowing where you stood in the hierarchy, because that's military culture. And it informs so much of who Donald Trump is. And when at times asked Donald Trump who his heroes were in American history, he gave 2 examples. One was General Douglas MacArthur, the other was General George S. Patton. So we know he reveres the military. I think he reveres it more for the kind of cultural component of it, rather than, the kind of guns and kind of the idea of violence. I don't think that's kind of what the appeal to him is. And so he likes being around those people, and he trusts them, and he can sort of speak their language. I think that's why we see him enjoying talking to them and choosing them for his administration.
Miles Hankin, I'm with the Fondation de France. Back to the unpredictability issue, I'm just wondering if you could comment on the implications specifically for U.S.-Europe relations. What are some of the ways that could or might play out? What are the questions that are open right now where unpredictability is either an advantage or a problem?
In a couple of ways, and one of the things that tends to perturb Americans or any allies of the United States, there tend to be two sort of buckets of concerns when you're talking about at least the security side of things. One is that they will get dragged into an ill thought out war that the United States thinks is a good idea and they do not. The other is that they'll be abandoned by the United States because we are more focused on pivoting to Asia or retrenching at home or whatever it is. And in both of those instances, but particularly in the abandonment one, unpredictability tends not to be a very useful tool, and predictability tends to be a whole lot better, because essentially you're trying to reassure your good allies that we're all in this together, that we have a similar outlook on the world, that we have potentially common adversaries, and that we're all willing to spend resources to keep skin in the game to confront these sorts of threats together. And so, the more the United States is unpredictable about its commitment to Europe, I think the more nervous Europe will get in some ways that are not helpful, with one exception, which is I think that having created unpredictability about its commitment to NATO in particular, you're already hearing the European countries talk about, they're all talking about increasing their defense spending and doing more, so as to forestall angering the new administration in part. And if this results in a renewed commitment to allies in Europe that are more capable, then that would be a good thing.
Hi, I'm Stacy Stowe. I'm a journalist. My question for Richard and Michael is about Trump's attitude, if he has expressed any, towards Saudi Arabia. And the United States has provided weapons to the Saudis and devastating effect in Yemen, and what's going on in Syria. Just don't know what his attitude is towards the Saudis and whether he'll feel that he has to act in deference to them or not.
That's definitely a Richard question.
Yeah, I can't recall him saying anything about Saudi Arabia, although I think he probably included them in a list of countries that he says we have protected and that they haven't paid their fair share. But I don't recall him singling out Saudi Arabia in that regard, as he sort of did with Japan and Korea, and went after that again and again. It's a different sort of situation with Saudi Arabia than it is with countries where you have a large troop deployment and partial host nation support for those expenses and things. And plus, the Saudis buy the weapons from the United States, so just give them to them. So that may make a difference too, but I don't have a better answer to your question.
But what about their support is the spread of Wahhabism, for example?
Unless you've heard it, I haven't heard him say anything about that at all.
No, I don't think he was.
I haven't heard everything he said.
I think he was singling out a lot of Middle Eastern countries in the campaign. Oddly enough, the debate over Islam was largely a domestic one during the Republican primary, as Donald Trump talked about his proposed ban on Muslim immigration in the United States, which interestingly he has not entirely backed away from, but he's also not talking about it at all. So it's one of those things that may kind of just wither and go away, or may not. I remember that, because I put together some notes and done some reading in the last 24 hours, and when Trump's been talking about some of these issues of kind of America, Trump has posited that America has been a sucker in global affairs since the 1980s, and it was in the 1980s that he placed an advertisement in several newspapers, including the New York Times, saying that the manner in which the United States provided protection for countries like Japan and included Saudi Arabia was not in American interests. We were not getting enough out of the money we were putting into it. So I just put that out there.
Well, he did talk about re-examining the Iran deal, which might be something which would be of interest for the Saudis.
Well, he didn't say re-examine, he said tear it up.
I was being diplomatic.
Re-examine it, you can look at it, tear it up, and you make it go
but it probably won't.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing here will be what the position of the Gulf allies actually is now that there is a deal. I mean, they weren't very fond of the deal as it was being negotiated and the parameters as it was coming out. But now that there is a deal and that Iran has been granted extensive sanctions relief, to tear up the deal would mean you relieve them from their ongoing non-proliferation restrictions or obligations after having already given them significant sanctions relief. So the horse is out of the barn at least halfway, and where they come down on that question, I don't know yet. I don't know that they have a position yet.
There are three big deals or pieces of legislation that we all are trying to understand whether we will truly tear up. The first is domestic, it's Obamacare. The second one is the Paris Climate Agreement, it's foreign, and the third is the Iran nuclear deal. And it's harder to tear things up than it sounds like. Once it's done, people become acclimated to it, and decisions are being made, and there are consequences to it. And I don't know if you agree with this. I think it will be easier for him to, in some ways, to create new things and new decisions than it will be to roll back old ones. Although there's so much pressure within the Republican world for all three of those deals to go away.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the Iran deal, now that it has been done for the reasons that I was describing, I think there's a strong argument for, rather than ripping it up or from just continuing the Obama policy as is, instead supplementing the Iran deal with a larger Iran containment strategy, which has been the piece that the Gulf allies in particular have complained the most about, but the Israelis to some degree, and those who sort of follow Middle East things, because they said, during the Cold War, you cut arms deals with the Soviet Union rather frequently, but that was in the context of a larger containment strategy where everyone knew that the United States was in opposition to the Soviet Union, and this was a way of diminishing the threat that they might otherwise pose. But you didn't muse openly about how this could be, the start of a great new relationship that could find common solutions to problems across the region and reorder the Middle East, which on occasion members of the Obama administration have done. But again, that in turn, that bumps up against what he might want to do in Syria. If he really wants to team up with Russia in Syria, that means teaming up with Assad and Iran in Syria at the same time that he wants to contain Iran. And the place where Iran is most expansive today is in Syria. So there you have it.
Thanks a lot. I don't know if do we have any more questions? Well, maybe I'll give you an opportunity, both of you, to conclude. And again, we know all of this is unpredictable. But yeah, of course. And so maybe this would be the way to conclude.
I want to follow a little bit up on Al's question, if I can. The Pew studies show that journalism is now approaching a pretty low level of credibility among the American public. And I am an independent voter. I'm registered and independent. But it always struck me in this campaign, sort of as I think Al mentioned, that there was a lot of negative about both, but it seemed to be a lot more about Trump. In almost every paper, there's some exceptions like the Post. From the inside, does it bother you that the essential purpose of journalism, to inform a public, you appear to be failing at? And what is the internal pressure to fix it?
You should never allow one more question.
Yeah, no, that's a question.
Well, I mean, maybe we could also enlarge to the professional experts, and maybe something.
I mean, I would strongly disagree with you that we're failing in our mission.
Well, the perception is you are.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that is incorrect. And I don't want to go chapter and verse through all of the coverage in the campaign, because that would not be productive. It would take a long time. But I'm absolutely confident that our coverage was as aggressive, fair, and informative in our coverage of both candidates. And even in the primary. I mean, when I started covering this campaign, it was I was assigned to cover Chris Christie, and I was assigned to cover Jeb Bush, and I was assigned to cover Mark Rubin. That's how unpredictable this campaign was. I think, again, out the Trump presidency is new and unfamiliar, it does not just challenge our journalistic conventions, it challenges the global order. I think the world is a little confused and a little unsettled, and quite open to the possibility that this could all work out perfectly fine. And I think that's the fascinating thing about the unpredictability of Donald Trump. We just really don't know where this is all going. I don't think he knew where his campaign was going. I'm not sure he even knew it was going to lead to the White House. And it has, and the world is now needing to react to it. It certainly looks, to zoom really, really far out, like a presidency that's going to be inwardly focused. I mean, that's what got him to the White House. It was a group of voters, and it was a large number of voters, but it wasn't the technical majority, who view this country and the promise of it as kind of slipping their grasp. It's not really being for them. And they're not just domestic questions, they're questions of all the trade deals that have been done over the last few decades. They're the question that Donald Trump asks, and has asked since the 1980s, which is, is America getting the raw end of the globalization deal that our leaders have told us is the right one for this country, and that the elite and the establishment of this country have bought into entirely. And Donald Trump stands in significant opposition to that. And again, we just don't know what it's going to look like when he gets into office, because the cabinet he's chosen is not full of people who share all of those views. They're not people who look at America's role as a kind of moral enforcer and democratizer and want to change that. But he argues that's not always going to be workable. And I defer to Richard on whether or not, how that's going to shake out. But I think both of us will tell you that there's just a lot of uncertainty, much, much more uncertainty about this presidency than we would have if it were Hillary Clinton or if it were almost anyone else.
And maybe I'll just offer one quick thought for what it's worth on your question and then the broader one. I don't think that it's the media's fault that we're in this sort of truthiness era. I think it's technology. It's driven by technology and the fragmentation of the information environment, and especially digital natives who don't place the same level of authority as we all used to in the New York Times or CBS Evening News or Walter Cronkite or someone like this. And I have an 11-year-old daughter, and I don't know if this happened in New York, but there was the crazed clown phenomenon was sweeping the Washington D.C. area, where all these kids were hearing these rumors that there were clowns hiding out in the woods around their schools waiting to kidnap kids and take them away or something. And I've got 4, so I was like, you can have half of them or something like that. But and of course there was no actual evidence of this, but this was going around everywhere. So my kids were pretty exercised about this coming home, and you see in their eyes they're afraid of these clowns that are in the woods behind the school and all this other stuff. They're getting kidnapped and everything. And so the Washington Post did a great story debunking this entire phenomenon, looking into the whole thing. So I showed my 11-year-old daughter the Washington Post story. She said, yeah, but I've got 2 websites that say it's true. And I was like, okay, well that's sort of the whole ballgame right there. And I don't know how we move away from that. I mean, I had a long conversation with my daughter, but well, who knows, right? But I think this decline of authority, Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said everyone's entitled to his opinions, but not to his own facts. And now everybody kind of does think they're entitled to their own facts, and that makes policy extremely difficult. And it makes rational debate very difficult, because when you never get beyond the debate over the facts, you can't get over what you're supposed to do about a common base of factual knowledge. And so that's hard. There's no answer on the horizon to how we deal with that, but it's something that we're going to have to work through as a country. The last point I guess I would make is that, and this really dovetails with what Michael just said, which I totally agree with. I mean, some of the issues that Trump raised during the campaign and some of the policy positions that he put out that I and others genuinely think are not good policy, I think have been dismissed on the wrong grounds. And so, those who are opposed to illegal immigration or even immigration per se are racist rather than worried about their jobs. I don't know that that's true. People who are opposed to trade are all economic illiterate rather than seeing their narrow interest in sectoral dislocation. I don't know that that's true. And so there's things like that. And so what this year has done to us, in addition to having, had this brand new phenomenon in in the White House has made us all think. And for what it's worth, I think that with the foreign policy elite especially has to really continue to think. I mean, people are on the losing end of globalization and automation and trade and, the kind of social policies and tax policies and immigration policies that we put into place. And the consensus behind those policies is pretty widely shared among the elite, whether Republican or Democrat. But people just voted for the opposite. And enough people voted that we all need to take this into account, or we're not going to have a politically sustainable foreign policy going forward. So that's, I think, the big challenge to the country.
Well, thank you so much to you both. I mean, I think I speak in the name of everybody here to say that we're very grateful for the fascinating discussion, wonderful, illuminating portrait of the president-elect, and also very analytical perceptions about the foreign policy landscape and the challenges ahead. So thank you so much, and please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you all for coming. I want to thank Baker McKenzie and our fellow executive committee member Skip Rankin for organizing this for us, and the New York Community Trust, one of our co-sponsors. Thank you very much. Look forward to the next session on the results of this election. Be fun.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
It was great. Perfect. Yeah. No, well, you did a great job.
I might take what you guys come up with, and I think there is greater value in truth-wise than a random blog or something like that. But when you wipe away that, you cannot be possible.
Hi there, Michael. That's okay.
Voilà, très bien. Oui, ça c'est bien, la Charity Life Project. Non. Oui, pourquoi pas. Oui, d'accord. Non, très bien. Très bien, ben enchanté. Enchanté. Oui, je regardais. Je n'ai pas assez sportif. Des agitations normalement, mais
Pas suffisamment.
oui, tout à fait. Là, il y a eu des micros, c'était dommage. On entendait les micros.
Ah oui, toujours. Oui, beaucoup la
Ah oui, on a ça en même temps. Donc c'était un petit peu. Oui. Ça me pas toujours très bien. Voilà. Merci. Joyeux
Moi, je sur la croissance, que ce soit en Chine ou au Japon. Moi, je suis plutôt le Japon, pour une question démographique très aiguë d'un pays qui est en décroissance démographique et qui est partout, ça a un impact réel.